Good morning. Are you very happy today, or is it every morning like this? My name is Jan. I work in the Department of Environment and Development, and we will talk today about different connections and links between the environment, security, and conflicts. I forgot to print out my presentation, and I also hate PowerPoint. So if I drift off, don't worry, I will come back to the presentation at some point. So the first clear or obvious connection we can make between the environment and conflicts is how conflicts, violent conflict, affects the environment, right? Think of an ecosystem where you can have direct physical impacts, right? Think of the Vietnam War, for example, where US troops would spray Agent Orange on the vegetation to basically destroy forest cover so that rebels couldn't hide underneath. It can also be, and this has been done for thousands of years, I guess, polluting water sources, polluting wells, right? I was just reading an historic novel where they describe very in detail how to do that. You take the bodies of your fallen enemies and throw them into the wells so that the people who come back later on cannot use those wells anymore. So pollution of natural resources, destruction of natural resources. Yeah, I'm super nervous. Happens after 15 years still. And that can happen, like I said, intentionally or sometimes also not intentionally, but there is an impact of just having heavy machinery driving through a forest, tanks going through a field, a rice field, that will affect the environment. There are other indirect impacts. So think about a community that just had its whole agricultural fields destroyed, access roads to markets had been destroyed. They have to flee the area, they have to move somewhere else. They have to find food and medicine and shelter in other regions, right? So they will, if they're lucky and there's a national park close by, they will go in there and start hunting those animals because they need food, right? Energy, so if the flow of, or the trade of, let's say, gas or certain energy sources stops coming to your community, you will use wood and basically start cutting down trees that you in the past might have enjoyed for other uses. Then there are also, this is going to be a bit more interesting in a few seconds, I just have to go through these points. Institutional impacts, okay? So a state is busy fighting a war or trying to suppress a rebellion. They are not focusing on environmental issues at that moment, right? The importance of having a national park system functioning during a civil war, that importance goes down, right? Also, when there's conflict, there's more illegality, right? You have whole areas of a country that might be with complete lack of state personnel, so you don't have any state officials taking care of basic things, and then you have illegal activities that often are linked again to natural resource extraction, deforestation, illegal logging, and illegal trade in biodiversity species, in animal species, and a simple lack of governance. So all that can be seen as institutional impacts of conflict on the environment. What I really wanted to talk about today is more the bigger picture of how environmental issues or the environment has been linked over the last 30, 40 years to conflict. And this is kind of an interesting small table that I found in that article that kind of shows the three different, or the three main categories of how to link environment and security, right? And the difference between them is basically in the first column, the referent or the level of analysis. So the first one focuses on the state, right? Environmental conflict, that's how we could call that literature. That's probably the most known. That means that if the environment changes, if there's environmental degradation, it is possible that that leads to national conflict, right? Conflicts at the nation level. The second one is that environmental change or environmental degradation leads to conflict or leads to insecurities at the community and individual level. Not so much the state, the nation, but at the individual and community level. And the third one is looking at it from the other, turning it upside down, that basically the environment is the one suffering from human activity. Okay, the global environment is the one under threat from us, right? And I will go through them one by one. Another way of looking at that is environment as a threat to national security. The second one would be environment as a threat to human security, individual level. And the third one, environment is under threat from or by human activity. Okay, in the first one, there are different visions or different ways of explaining how the environment can be a threat to national security. Okay. Environmental scarcity came up as a keyword in the 1990s when Homer Dixon, a Canadian researcher, focused on how environmental change, and especially environmental scarcity, could be linked to to some of the violent conflicts that were visible in that time, especially, I think, mostly civil wars and not so much interstate wars. The other one, the counter argument, let's say, would be that actually it's not scarcity, it's an abundance of resources, the existence and presence of a certain resource that can be correlated to conflict. And as you can see already, we're talking about two different things, right? Environment, and natural resources. These are different, but I will come to that. So the environmental scarcity causing conflict argument can be, again, divided into three different parts. This is all taken from Homer Dixon's work, and it's a simplification. And I hope I don't oversimplify it too much, because this session is recorded and somebody might see it who knows actually about these things much more than I do. So Homer Dixon basically said environmental scarcity can be caused or explained by three different processes. Okay? Scarcity can come from an increase in demand. Okay, you have, somebody used that example of a pie, right? You have a pie and there's more people wanting to eat that pie, right? So there's more people demanding an X amount of resources, you have scarcity, right? Each person will have less of that cake. You invited too many people. That can happen because of overconsumption due to overpopulation. It can be because there's overproduction, right? In a capitalist system, that is very common, that we overproduce. Economic growth is based on overproduction. The other way that scarcity can happen is through the supply side, right? the resource itself, even if the demand stays the same, the resource becomes less. The cake, let's say, has mold on one half of it. Or, again, through overuse, the amount of the resource is being degraded, lessened, and therefore, even if the demand stays the same, each person has actually less of that resource. The third one, he called it structural scarcity, is when you have a pie, you have an X amount of people wanting that resource, but a tiny part of that group prevents others from having access to that resource. Okay, so there's, again, scarcity in a way that the people who don't have access to that resource feel that they are living in a situation of scarcity. The resource is actually there, but they can't get it, right? And others have actually much more than they need. Why? Because they can, right? Because they're powerful, and that's it. Yes?
I don't understand how overproduction can induce scarcity.
Okay, so I put that there because oftentimes we think that consumption, overconsumption, only means us as the end user buying more stuff. Overproduction, I mean with that sometimes the amount of stuff that is being produced should be, the production process is consumption as well. It has not much to do with how much I consume or we consume, because the market does not function as most people might think, that it's a reaction to the demand, but that the demand is created, right? So you produce as much as you can to make as much profit as you can. So what I mean by that is that you take more than is actually needed to produce, right? In some sectors. Any other comments or questions? I think he was thinking more of let's say you have a lake and there's a fishing village, and you also have an industry, a chemical plant that starts to pollute the lake, and then the fishing population goes down and the fishing community is facing difficulties, right? They have less fish, so they are living in scarcity in that sense. So it's more like something that didn't come from the direct demand for that resource that reduced it. That could be one, that fishing village constantly sells fish, and then at some point they didn't realize that they are doing that at a rate that is unsustainable. So the fish population doesn't reproduce as fast as they take fish out. That could be also one example of overproduction in that way. Or through the degradation of that resource from other sources, right? But yeah, in a way, if you see it as a time sequence, that could be as well, right? If you have overconsumption, that leads to a supply side, right? A problem of the supply side. Okay, what do you think of the structural scarcity that is part of environmental scarcity? That is one of the things that I want you to discuss later on, so don't worry. We can do that later. But it's kind of, it should feel a bit weird. Why is it called environmental scarcity if the resource that we're talking about is actually there, but just somebody prevents another group of having access to it? Right? That, I don't know, for me that shouldn't be called environmental scarcity. Should be called something more nasty, right? And more direct to, I don't know, power. Sorry? Would it be a more economic? Is that yeah, totally. Or a political or a racist or a whatever. Exactly, right? And the environmental part is just a tool of creating or maintaining that power difference, right? Well, if, for example, if I have access to a lake and I can fish and all you guys can just stand behind the fence and look at me and I can sell the fish to you, I will maintain my power, right? And I can raise the price whenever I want, as long as the fence is strong and high. And then I make more money and I can hire soldiers, and if you touch the fence, I shoot you, right? That kind of thing. It's kind of a strange example, but so Homer Dixon said also, scarcity in itself is not enough, right? Because we know, of course, that there are many people who live in zones where there is not much water and they are not fighting, they're not killing each other, right? There's a whole bunch of people living in very dry areas and they're living more or less peacefully. So he said that there must be something else. And this environmental scarcity can only lead to conflict if there's a feeling of relative deprivation, right? That I am suffering while my neighbor is not, or we are suffering as an ethnicity, the others are not. That makes you feel uncomfortable and gets you into, yeah, let's say you get into more extreme feelings of hate, of jealousy that can lead to conflict as well. But you also need a state that is incapable of controlling or of suppressing a situation that might lead to violent conflict, right? As long as you have a strong state where you can go and, or institutions in general that can help you prevent from going from a normal conflict of interest to an escalation of conflict that leads to violence. If you have a state that can do that, then it's not as easy. So these things are important, right? Homer Dixon said you have environmental scarcity plus this really, let's say, psychological level of feeling deprived, plus the lack of institutions to prevent the conflict from escalating. So some counter arguments to that scarcity argument could be that sometimes scarcity actually leads to technological innovation, right? If there is not enough land for all my 11 sons and I'm a farmer, that doesn't mean that we all will starve. It could mean that 10 of my sons actually will do something completely different, right? They will go and one becomes a hunter, another one becomes a car mechanic, and the other one we managed to get him into university, whatever. There can be all kinds of diversification of the economy. Also, when there's a scarcity of a certain resource, there is trade, right? We can bring that stuff in. If there's demand for it, it might be very profitable to actually bring something, import something. So all these could be seen as positive things or things that make the scarcity less important, right? The other one is that researchers quickly found out how, like I said before, the presence of certain resources is correlated with conflicts much more than the scarcity of other resources. So people started investigating these things in much more detail than before and realized that there were some resources that were then coined conflict resources. And these resources, by being in that region, they were abundant in a certain region, they seemed to be leading to conflict much easier than the absence of resources. But of course, this is a relative abundance because These resources have a high value because they are scarce on the global level, right? So they have a high price on international market, but they are very abundant in certain specific spots of the planet. And in those spots, oftentimes you have conflict that is very hard to finish, very hard to end, because parties of that conflict benefit from the conflict, right? These resources finance conflict. They are the engine of the conflict. And so much so that some of these conflicts have moved from being a political conflict or a conflict that had political causes or drivers. They became a financial conflict at the end. Right? The parties were about maintaining the conflict because both parties, or 3 or 4 parties, were benefiting economically from the conflict. Yes? Right. For me, that would be any mineral, like diamonds, gems, timber, oil, probably. But there are also a lot of differences between those, right? How easy is it to get them out? How easy is it to transport them? How easy is it to sell them? You had your hand up also?
Yeah, I had a question about resource prices. You said that, say, like the coltan mine in the Great Lakes region, 2 groups are at war over it. They both finance buying their weapons and their operations off selling it. When, like, let's say, I'm coming in to buy it, it's more costly for me to get there because of the conflict, so the price of the mineral goes up. Would that be the kind of dynamic?
Maybe. It could also be that the price is lower for you, right? Because there is chaos, nobody controls it. These different parties are fighting among each other and trying to get as much weapons as possible. They might even exchange, a very valuable mineral for weapons, for food in a time of crisis, and that will make the difference in their war, let's say, in their conflict.
Downward pressure on prices. Couldn't that also lead to the end of the conflict in the sense that, like, it becomes so low, or it becomes cheaper to get anywhere else because there's less of these factors associated? Do you see that happen?
The problem is, again, if that resource only exists in that region, or maybe in 2 of the planet, then how will you end that conflict, right? I think, for me, what I've read is actually that these conflicts are almost impossible to stop, right? Because the parties of that conflict are not just fighting constantly, but they are sometimes in a position of a balance of power. Say, okay, you guys, you use that area, you can rape these people, I rape these people, you take that mineral, I take this, and we're all doing fine, right? And that can be rebel groups, it can be a government, it can be a dictator, it can be a so-called democratically elected president. These people all find themselves in a situation that they don't want to end, right? They all benefit from it. They have a great life. And of course, these people are not the ones actually doing the fighting, they have little kids for that, right? Or little younger people doing the actual fighting. And this, so the abundance, like I said, is a relative abundance because on the global level there's a very high demand. So these things are very much de-linked from only local processes, but they are totally linked on the global consumption processes. Like the example that you just gave about coltan being linked to our addiction to all these things, right, that we use like this. And it's also linked again to an economic system that is based on infinite growth. So the financing of conflict, like I said, is sometimes the factor that makes it difficult to end the conflict, right? Because it becomes so lucrative to be in conflict that you don't want to end it. Okay, so there's still a lot of debate about these things. And like I said at the beginning, it depends on what we're really talking about. Resources, natural resources, are social constructs, right? We, as humans, make something that is natural or part of the environment into a natural resource. And these things change over time, right? There might be new resources in the future that suddenly have a use that right now are useless. Or there are also things that are very important for the survival, like the difference between water and diamonds, right? Water is pretty important, diamonds not so much. And I always make the same joke. I hope the people who sit here every year have to just bear with it. Diamonds, for me, even though I know they are important for industry and for cutting certain things, I'm sure they are super important for some aspects of our life, but they are pretty useless, right? If you think about how, have you seen that movie, Blood Diamonds? Yes. And you think about the use that we give to those things, right? A ring to show love. You could just put some glass in it. Most people wouldn't see the difference. And anyway, it doesn't mean anything, right? It's a shiny piece of something tiny that you can wear on your finger. Like I said, I'm sure there is something more to diamonds than that. But in my life, it's not really important, I think. Water is, right? Water is super important for everything. For our clothing, for every production process needs water, and also the little detail that we need it to survive, right? We need to drink. And it's cheap in most countries compared to other resources that are not as important. So basic needs are important. Some resources are important for basic needs while others are not. So after some time when researchers were still debating between is it environmental scarcity, is it the abundance of resources, people started to, or some people started to question this whole approach and criticizing it because basically this whole environmental conflict debate or research agenda was focusing on national security in the north, right? People were not really, let's say, preoccupied or worried about the fate of people in the global south. They were only preoccupied with that once they realized that these people would maybe move north and affect northern national security. Or if some violent conflict in, let's say, near a trade route would impact trade and economic development of the northern nations. But there was not really much care about the suffering of people in the global south. So they said we need to look at how environmental change affects people's lives, right? So the human security idea that was floating around already for some years was linked to that debate, okay? So how does environmental change that is often caused by northern nations and people, how does it affect the quality of life, the freedom and the peace of people in the global south at the individual and community level? So there was a shift of focus, kind of like a deepening from the national abstract level to the community and individual level, right? I could immediately say something very sarcastic about that. I will try not to be too sarcastic. It is important. I think that is super valuable that people realize that this is important to research. It's also pretty straightforward, right? If you are poor and the environmental conditions change, you will suffer more. The same structures that create your poverty are the structures that create environmental degradation. But apparently that was necessary to do more research on. So basically, any environmental factor on the local level, on the national level, on the global level, will affect the individual that is already depending on very local natural resources for their survival. Climate change affects these people more than where I come from, right, in Germany, in our daily lives. But still, I think the important here was the critique of that focus on national security in the north, which wasn't really talked about until that point. Because these guys who started looking at this whole environment conflict stuff, it's also important to remember when this happened in the early 90s and mid 90s. It was a great way to create more importance for the military and for the whole, let's say, security world, right? Remember what happened before that, just before that? Soviet Union collapsed, right? The wall, the Berlin Wall fell, and you still had all this security apparatus and all this military, and suddenly there was no more enemy, right? The Cold War ended. What do you do with all these people? Let's find a new threat to security, the environment, right? That was kind of, as some say, what happened. And I tend to agree with that. I have not done any real research on that, but it sounds super logical to me. But then something else happened, and the environment again became less important. What happened after the 90s? 9/11, right? Terrorism. That pushed this whole environmental stuff back. So now we are again trying to bring climate change as a national security threat to the table, right? 20 years later. 20 or 30? 20. When you get older, like decades, you mix them up. It's like, wow, it's 30? No. Yeah. And also the environmental, let's say the environmental people were very keen on environmental conflict because it brought attention to the environment, right? If I have an NGO that is focusing on environmental protection, nature protection, conservation, and somebody says, oh yeah, and if nature gets over-consumed, if it gets destroyed, then there's also more potential for violent conflict. Awesome. I needed that, right? Something else to make people give me money so that I can keep running my NGO. Not sarcastic at all, right? So it was very sexy, right, for many people to have these arguments and keep on insisting on them so much. The third, so after, from the focus on the nation state, conflicts at the nation or the state level, going deeper into the individual community level. Now others said, actually we need to broaden it. We need to step away from this whole thing and see that the problem is actually that the environment is under threat from us, right? Human activity. And I'm not talking about the first slide where violent conflict has impacts on the environment, on nature, but actually how our way of life affects the global system. So already in the 70s, some people got together as the Club of Rome and talked about limits to growth, right? There was fear of overpopulation again, of over-consumption, too much growth, and that there are limits to that growth. Right? The planet is a closed system. If population keeps on growing unchecked, we will cross a certain limit that has consequences. The same with resource use and economic growth. If we keep on insisting that we can grow and grow and grow and take from the environment as much as we want and pollute the environment as much as we want, there are certain limits, right? So climate change is a symptom of overstepping one of those limits, or several. And there was also a whole other, let's say, discipline that was studying global environmental change. There are literatures, debates about what causes deforestation, what are the consequences of that, what can be done to stop it. And these all basically were making the same point, right? We are already overstepping the natural limits of our system, which is the planet. And it will get worse and worse. And the explanations, as always, like I said, too many people, overpopulation, and overproduction of a global economic system that cannot stop growing, right? Because of its systemic nature, capitalism has to grow. There cannot be a real capitalist system that does not grow. Because of competition, because of the need to always outcompete your competitors. And there's also, of course, this huge faith in thinking that only economic growth will lift people out of poverty, right? So, if that is so, the global climate, the global biosphere in itself is under threat. So we went from the national to the human, and now back to the individual, now back to the global system. And some people are arguing for calling our geological epoch as the Anthropocene, right? The human era, because we as a human species are affecting the planet on a planetary scale. So much so that we should call it the Anthropocene. And there's, again, a lot of discussions and debates. When did this start, with the Industrial Revolution, or later on, when we reached a certain amount of people? And it basically shows, bless you, how important human activity or humans are in causing environmental change. And there's always these Marxists, right, who then say, actually, we should call it Capitalocene. Because it's capitalism, right? It's not the amount of people, because there's inequality. People who know me know that I get really excited about this. My nerdiness comes out. And it's a fascinating topic, I think. Because if it was just human numbers, then the solution would be pretty simple, right? We either kill off half of the population, or we prevent them from being born. But then you look at data and you realize that most people have actually no impact at all, right? It's the affluence, their lifestyles, that is the unsustainable thing about this whole thing. Obviously, human numbers are important. If everybody would live like a European, or like a Tico, or like a US citizen, I used to say only like a US citizen, but then I always got comments from the US citizens. Then I used to say Germans always, because I'm kind of German. Then I said I can say whatever I want about Germans, but then they were German students also. And then so, but you get my point, right? But then is it really a problem of the amount of people, or is it about the lifestyle of those regions, right, of those people? The other question is, if we were only 1 million people, on this planet, would we all live like Bill Gates? Or would we actually have 2 Bill Gates and some kind of rich people, and all the rest of us would be picking coffee for them? Could be, right? Because somebody has to pick the coffee. Somebody has to pick up the garbage. So there are some who argue that inequality will exist no matter how many people there will be. And there will actually be people who we might have a situation where there is much less people, but still people starving, right? Under this capitalist system. Because that is, for the Marxist perspective at least, that is the main driving force of this unsustainability, of overstepping the limits. The importance of the Anthropocene term is that it brings attention to a wider group, that human activity, human lifestyle as a global, which I already kind of hinted at, doesn't really make sense to talk about the global humanity in that way, because we all have different impacts on the environment. But it brings attention to the fact that humans are changing the system. So there's kind of a paradox now when you think about security and the global environment, the ecological security paradox. So if what we have is a situation where the status quo, that is what we want to protect, right? If that is what causes environmental change to such a degree that it affects our status quo, then what can we do, right? What do we change in this circle? And obviously the only thing, there's 2 arrows shown. You said there's only 1. Anyway, just a little insider joke. So it's kind of this paradox, right? How do we break this cycle? The status quo is the one that produces environmental change, which affects the status quo. So obviously we can only, there's 2 things that we can do. We can either stop the environmental change by being very optimistic. You hate that when I do that, right? By saying we can be more efficient, we can use technology, we don't need to change anything, we just do things differently, and then there's less environmental change. Or we have to change the status quo. Or both. Or, number 4, which is what we do right now, we don't do anything, right? And we just wait and hope. Scientists will figure it out. Our presidents will figure it out. Or I just take shorter showers. Then all is good, right? Take cold showers in the morning, save the planet. Great. Don't use straws. Exactly. I made much nastier comments normally about these things. But then always I have to say at the end, everything matters, even the straws, right? Okay. I'm pretty much done. So let's open this up for questions, discussions, if you have any.
Geographical barriers and facilitators also cause environmental conflicts, like for example, the port of Aden in Yemen, which is like an important site for transportation of petróleo. Would that also be a part, or does it have to be like the certain area where the resources are taken out of, or could it also be like certain areas where the resources are being transported?
So you mean, can that also lead to conflict in that region?
Conflict, according to...
I guess so, yeah. I mean, if we think about resource conflicts, piracy is a resource conflict, right? You attack somebody's goods and take them, So yeah, trade routes, for sure.
I mean, it's like, sorry, I just have a quick answer. It's, Gloria, it's like the pipeline battles in North America. That's not the site where the oil's being extracted, but it's part of the infrastructure and it's part of the conflict over how to use the space.
This is more about your view, but why are you so drastic and sarcastic? Just no, really, I just want to know. Like no, like
Drastic?
I'm curious. I'm curious.
What do you mean I'm drastic?
Some solutions are pretty extreme.
Okay. Yeah, that was kind of like a joke at the end.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, I am kind of like that actually. So
Because you have a lot of experience, so I just
yeah, maybe I just feel I get very upset. I used to get tired. Now I'm getting upset about people who just repeat and repeat and repeat a solution that is not working, right? So I don't believe in most of the solutions that are being presented and talked about in the mainstream with friends that work in environmental NGOs or for the government. This faith that the free market will solve everything, right? That we just need to price everything, that the private sector will this and this and this. The private sector has a role to play, but let's not leave it only to the private sector. Because the private sector is living in a system that is not sustainable.
So yeah, like for example, you don't believe in I don't know, like pricing the environmental services, this sort of thing.
I think there's a value to that in the sense that it makes people realize that certain things do have a financial value, but I don't think that knowing that will change anything. Because most often, these environmental services will never have the same value as a pineapple field, right? And because there's power in this world. We don't choose as a society what private people can do with their land unless you regulate it. Okay? So if we all decide that this field, this grassland here should be a forest, and we can do that, that is one way. Or we can say, actually, let's plant pineapples and make a lot of money and have scholarships for UP students. But in the real world, this is somebody's land, right? And that somebody will do with that land what is most beneficial for that person. So it's, even if there's a forest and we tell him that this forest is worth $10,000 for all of us, he says, well, for me, it's worth $80,000 if I put pineapple on it. And I have the power to do it. So thank you very much for your nice comment and your study. Get off my land, and I cut it all down, right? So I'm a bit skeptical about the market as the only solution.
So then can you, or what do you think the merits of the argument that resources are an opportunity for cooperation rather than conflict? I just want to see you make the case, because I know that
I will make
that's
the case.
the opposite of what you just said.
Yeah. So there's a whole, again, argument there that certain natural resources can be used for a peace process, right? To end after a conflict, you can use certain natural resources to recreate and kickstart an economy. And yes, I guess that's very true. If you have the political situation that permits that. If not, which is why I argue always that these are not environmental issues, really, right? So if you have a perfect system, then having a lot of forests and clean rivers and a lot of water and oil is great. You can take out the oil, you sell it, you build schools with that, you train your future teachers, you buy the best food that you can get for your population. But that's sadly not what really happens, right? So it's not about, I mean, the resources are there. If you have timber, you can use that to kickstart your economy. Yes. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's not because of the trees or the timber, it's because of the people in power, right?
Sir, I'm quite confused about either way, like scarcity and abundance can cause conflicts, because I think these terms are very relative. Especially like 3 days ago, I heard from a Uber driver from here, like in the coast areas in Costa Rica, like they kind of allow Chinese vessels to take fish out of the ocean, while at the meantime they restrict the local fishermen to take fish. And I think this, from the abundance perspective, it can be explained that because Costa Rica has a lot of fish, that attract like foreigners to come here to get fish. But also from the scarcity perspective, it can be like because globally, like there's no enough fish for everyone, so that caused the conflict. So how would you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a resource that is very scarce in coastal waters, right? Plus you have the environmental movement of Costa Rica saying we need to create marine national parks or reserves. And the way these local fishermen fish is very destructive, right? This, I don't know how to say that in English. They have these nets that they pull, dredging, right? I don't know. Arrastre in Spanish? Drag, right? So you basically wipe out all the biodiversity on in that area, and larvae and eggs and all that stuff, and other species that are not really wanted. So the civil society, or some parts of civil society in Costa Rica, are going against that, trying that the government prohibits that use. And yes, there are some discussions about international fishing fleets coming into further away, not in the real coastal areas, but in the, I don't even know how these things are called. Like there's a certain marine zone, 200 nautical miles or something, that they can actually fish. I don't know if it's legally that they do that, or they can just do it because we don't have any means of controlling our marine area, right? Which then means basically that we don't care as a country. And the fishermen of Punta Arenas don't have probably the vessel size of doing that kind of fishing. Right? I don't know if I answered your question. Yep.
I think it was last year, or like 2 years. Sorry, thanks. I think it was like 2 years ago. Costa Rica signed an agreement with La FAO. That's the Agriculture International Organization. FAO. I can't remember the. It was the first international fishing agreement to regulate this type of things. So they're starting to do it. And even though it's illegal, the Chinese and Japanese still do it, mostly like for the sharks' fins. But it's beginning now. 2 years from now, it's starting to get regulated, but it wasn't really. So it's a thing that's a process. It's happening slowly. And the new government, it's having a lot of conversation with the local fishermen on how do we regulate this without affecting the locals' economy on it. So it's a in and out situation. It's being processed.
And these conflicts are super interesting because sometimes, like we forget that these people are claiming to have a right to keep on doing something, right? And if, I don't know, some other person, let's say, who is a bus driver, if the economy changes and there's no more tourists, he will not go on strike and tell the government, you have to provide tourists for me, right? I have a right to be a bus driver. No, you find something else to do. But with fishermen, there's this romantic idea that they want to be fishermen only, and they can only do that. Maybe I'm making a horrible point right now, but you know what I mean? Like I feel sometimes that we romanticize certain lifestyles or certain things that maybe aren't really that important to keep.
Well, you get that out of the investment. You already have a boat and all your fishing gear.
Sure.
Just find something else to do.
Right.
It's easier said than done.
Absolutely.
Buy your boat.
Right, but there's also farmers, right, who can compete with a big agro industry, and then they are basically left to find something else to do, right?
We have that in the States. Bring back coal. Bring back coal.
Right.
It's not going to happen. But
Just to touch back on the point of other countries coming and fishing in the region, I know that there's a specific type of quite large fishing boat that Costa Rica doesn't actually own, but they have a quota for on the international market. So they sell their quota to other countries to use those boats in their waters.
Oh,
So I think that's, I mean, it's not all of it, but that's maybe an aspect of why other countries come and fish here, and they can do it legally.
Didn't know that.
I would like to know again the difference between environmental conflicts, geopolitical conflicts, and resource conflicts. Can we draw a line between these three words?
I think environmental conflicts sound very nice and easy to understand, but are actually completely, is a meaningless term because it means so many different things. It includes resource conflicts. And I think that there is no real, I cannot think of any real example where something is only an environmental conflict. Right? Like climate change can contribute to outcomes of conflicts. It can contribute to maybe triggering or making a conflict more violent than it would have been. It can make conflicts more serious. Like there's a lot of studies on the Syria conflict and the role of climate change. But you cannot just blame climate change for that conflict, right? That, again, anything that makes a very complicated or complex process seem to be very simple, you should be suspicious about that. And anything that looks logical and apolitical is mostly wrong, right? In those things. There's always the political aspect behind these processes. Geopolitical was the third one. I think you need natural resources for any type of conflict, right? You need either you want more of those resources or you need them to sustain the conflict. I mean, most conflicts that are between, let's say, faraway places have to do with resources at the end. If you think about history, right? Why did people move from Europe to Latin America and to discover and then plunder it, right? That's a resource conflict. But it's not an environmental conflict. Yes?
That's the FARC conflict in Colombia, and how I just keep how the FARC conflict actually helped preserve the forests in Colombia and in Panama, because the government just wouldn't go in because there were so many guerrilleras and guerrillas going inside their terrain, and it was so hard to go in. So this is, I guess, an opposite example how the environment actually helped keep on going with this conflict for so many years, because nobody will go inside there that dense tropical forest. So it's how that and the other part helped preserve the Colombian forest to what it is nowadays, such a big environment, so important for the rest of the world. So it's, I don't know, like,
yeah, sometimes
of it.
Armed conflict can be good for nature, right? Or the Cold War also between, let's say, the border area between East and West Germany. It's now a huge national park because it was the death zone, right? Like between the Koreas. There was this area where people wouldn't go, and then you have an amazing ecosystem. The other thing with environmental conflict, like the most common example I would guess are these water conflicts, right? Where you can read that a lot in any, let's say, non-academic journals or newspapers, that the next world war will be about water and all these things. And there are some people who still believe that, but there's a lot of academics who are actually arguing that it almost never really happened, right? We still have scarce water resources in many parts of the world, but people are not going in a full armed conflict to solve that issue. Right? Until now, I don't know. It might happen in the future, but until now there has been no real super big international conflict about water. Right? It seems as if it's better to solve these issues in different ways.
Is your definition of what would count as a water conflict like two states trying to gain control of a single river, like a very direct?
Right.
Okay.
I mean like a full-out war between two
interstate
countries.
conflict.
Conflicts definitely happen all the time, right? On the local level.
Okay.
And there can be violence, of course.
So what do you think of the argument that the Syrian civil war is a water conflict? Because in the 5 years leading up to Arab Spring, if something like 80% of livestock in certain rural areas died from lack of water, and you had like 1 million people move to the cities, does it maybe make it harder for us to see resources over conflict when the conflict erupts after these knock-on effects, right? Like this region dries up, people have to move to the city, there's unemployment, eventually that turns into enemy over this against the state for all these reasons.
Yeah, like I said, I think there's many instances where these things play a very important role, but they are never the sole source of that conflict.
It's never the trigger.
Because you have so many other examples where similar things happened, but it didn't go all the way to that level. So there must have been something else, right? There must have been something that, or maybe in this case, it was so extreme that triggered the whole thing.
Do you have any examples of something you would unequivocally consider a resource conflict?
Like I said, for me, most conflicts over oil are resource conflicts. But is it useful to call them resource conflicts, or is it a conflict about simply, power and growing
Unlike all those other conflicts.
Right. And the oil is just a tool for that. No? So why is oil so important? Because it runs our economy, right? We base everything on oil.
Do you think there's any benefit academically or to inspire any change to label these things as resource conflicts or environmental conflicts or whatever you? Because it just seems like a semantics type of thing. Like, why does that matter?
In a sense, I agree with the environmental movements who saw that as one more thing to draw attention to that topic. Because it's not just some topic, right? We're talking about the global environment, which is the base of existence on this planet for life as we know it. So it should be used, all these things can be used to make that point. On the other hand, it probably takes away attention from the real issue, right? So if we call something an environmental conflict, it seems almost as there's nothing much we can do about it, right? Or we can just go, it means there's too many people. So it's an overpopulation conflict. And I don't believe that. Or I refuse to take that as seriously as people make it. So I don't know. I don't know if I think it's good or bad. Yes?
So essentially your point for all of us is that environmental factors and geography matter to conflict. And like, if it doesn't necessarily, like there's a reason to be talking about it, and it's personally fascinating to me, but when it comes to conflict and conflict analysis, whether we call it a conflict or a resource conflict or environmental conflict, that is kind of semantics, and we just have to know how that might factor in to the context or to the interests, to the positions of different actors.
Absolutely. I think it is super important if you analyze a conflict to see that there is a role for the environment, there's a role for natural resources to play, but it's never the sole reason for a conflict. Right? As I also don't believe that ethnicity is the sole reason for a conflict. Right? Inequality. There's always more things. Religion can become the source of conflict when it's linked to other things. right? None of these contextual factors are the only reason in any conflict, I think. But it's oftentimes there is this feeling of being on the suffering part, or being the one, the minority, feeling that you are treated unequally. That is something common in most conflicts.
Wouldn't you think that? I think everybody can hear me. Wouldn't you think that due to the fact that, as the lecturer said, most of the people that suffer from like the results of the environmental problems and all of these conflicts are the ones that are the poorest in the world, is the fact that we don't see it as a main like kind of source most of the times? Because like, for example, some time ago, actually it was in this program, we arrived into a couple of islands. One of them was Solomon Islands, and like the first and Vanuatu, and like the first thing they said in these little flat islands in the middle of the Pacific was like, enjoy it, in 20 years this is not gonna exist anymore. And like they said it like kind of like acknowledging the fact that they know that thing is gonna just be underwater in a few years, but like nobody else in the world like probably even knows where they are, or like actually cares about the fact that they're gonna basically disappear, and they're like trying to figure out themselves what to do. Meanwhile, like the rest of the places are like kind of fine with it. So wouldn't you think that's part of the fact that we don't really like evaluate it as a main source of conflict?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that most people are not aware of what's going on with the environment, and also not aware of how important it is to have a healthy environment? For sure. It doesn't touch many people, right? Like us in our social class, doesn't really matter. We hear about there's the huge increase in the price of basic foods. So what? No, you still go to the supermarket. Price of oil, does it affect how much I drive my car? Not really. Right? There's a crisis. There's people starving. Yeah, but what can I do? Right? So I think we don't see the consequences. We don't fear the consequences of global environmental change until much later. Right? And again, it might sound a bit drastic, but I think we often are like that. Like we wait until something really, what is that nice saying? When it hits the fan, right? Then you do something. If not, you still think like, nah, I will be okay, right? That's something we do in all kinds of stuff. Yes.
I just want to ask about the pineapple plantation. I just learned that to meet the EU market regulations, the plantation here need to use so many agri-chemicals, and it contaminated water, and it has dangerous effect to local people, and also the market pressure would affect the labor cost, and even organic farmers cannot be protected. So how can we find a way to sustainably produce this product?
So I think the pineapple is a great example for many things. So pineapple, as you know, is being produced in Costa Rica for at least the last 10 years in a massive way. I think we used to be, until very recently, one of the main producers of pineapple on the planet. We're also one of the smallest country in the world. And we also use, I think, more pesticides per land area than any other country. So for all those vegans out there, switch to eating meat, because you will get cancer in your stomach if you eat only vegetables and fruit. That was a little joke. So when you have a product that has to be sold outside, then you will have, for example, like you said, the European Union is saying now we need to be careful because the stuff that is coming out of Costa Rica, the pineapples are all full of pesticides, and they have all this negative baggage, right, affecting the health of local communities living near the pineapple plantations. And that is probably because there was civil society movements showing that problem in Costa Rica that then was leaked to other areas. And then at that point, somebody in the government or the state regulators tried to address this issue. And you can produce pineapple organically. It's not as profitable, but you can do it and you can have a good life. We will go on a field trip in 2-3 weeks with our department to see that. So it's possible. They are delicious, but it's not as profitable, right? So the question is then, why did it take so long for the European Union to do something about it? Because, like most often, the states don't really do what they have to do, right? They should. First thing for me that a state should do should be protect your citizens, and if they let all these pesticides into the food that the citizens eat, then they're not fulfilling their basic function. Is it a market-based solution? No, I don't think so. It's a regulation, right? It has to come from pressure from civil society, but at the end, it's just common sense. If you can produce something that is not harmful for humans, then you should do that. But in the economic system that you have, it makes more sense to use pesticides, right? Because the profit is higher, and that's the only thing that matters.
Kind of going back to what Diego was saying about, what were you saying? Oh, the island, and in 20 years it's not going to be there. That kind of made me think of what you said at the very beginning of your lecture, like talking about the reasons for caring about climate issues at all. Like, I think it's a lot easier for people to care when it's something that is directly affecting people, because like you said, it's the Anthropocene, it's this period that we're in is like all about human populations. But then if you think about like, okay, well, what about like just the value? I don't know, it's like value and ideology of, does the planet have value besides just what the value is to people? And I think it's harder to kind of like reach a lot of people on just the, I don't know, non-human value of the earth, instead of just seeing it as like a resource for people. Like, does it have any other larger other value?
And then if it has that value, how do you measure it, right? And how do you translate that into action, right? And then probably the outcome of that is that people will start flying more to see that island before it disappears, contributing even more to climate change, right? But maybe that money can be used with more tourists and you build higher walls, or I don't know, fly in some sand. But probably what's going to happen is really that people will use the planes more to see it before it gets eliminated. And yes, the more it affects us personally, the more we would care about things, obviously, no? Yes?
I know it's kind of spectacle, but I remember Elon Musk was doing the electronic cars, and then he was one of in New York Times. They were writing about he was starting to use it like vegan leather, and it was they were like praising about how he was thoughtful about this environmental issues and stuff, and how he was started to using that thing for Tesla. But for me, like, it's just he's trying to cover it, like all the shit that he has done, like all this thing that he damages for a long time and stuff. But I just want to know your opinion, like, do you think he was really solving the problem, or it's just like PR stunt that he was doing it?
Who are you talking about?
Elon Musk.
I really have no idea. I don't know, I kind of didn't really get into that guy so much. I know that many people are talking about him. I hope that he comes up with awesome technology that will be more efficient. He's one of the richest people on this planet, right? Probably, or not? Imagine, I don't even know that. But I don't know, I don't know about him much. The only thing that I see is like some stuff on Facebook, and I always think like, interesting. That's it. Maybe I should know more about him.
Okay, going back a little bit to the issue that the environment can cause environmental effects or impacts can cause conflict. Can't you regard the issue of overuse of pesticides in Costa Rican pineapple plantations contaminating water sources, and the protests that have come from such protests and against contamination of water resources to be a conflict that comes from the environment, or you would still argue that because a resource called water is involved, so it's a conflict about natural resources?
For me, it's not a conflict about natural resources, it's a conflict about a company doing things that are totally illegal, right? And a state not implementing its laws and not protecting its citizens. How is it possible that we saw in one of the field trips last year, we were in this one community and we could see the impact of that pesticide use. There was a kid, she was like what, 12, 11, do you guys remember her in Longomai? She had no arms, right? And that was probably due to the fact that her mother was working on the pineapple fields. You don't remember that? Okay. Jesus, I remember it. And so that, that was very visible to see the impact. So people know that. Also Costa Rica, as most other tropical countries, have gone through the whole banana plantation situation that was exactly the same. So it's not an environmental issue, right? The environment or the pineapple, the water is part of that production chain, but it's not, for me, it's not an environmental issue. It's an issue of who has the power to get away with these kind of things, right? To contaminate water that is being used for hundreds of communities, water that should be owned by all of the people of this country, and that should be a human right for everybody who is here. The tourists should have a right to have clean water and not drink pesticides. So for me, that is not an environmental conflict. There will be, in the future, if it goes on, it might erupt into really a violent conflict, right? People might get sick of it and really say, look, this has to stop and we will kick these people out of here. But most often again, we don't deal with it because it's kind of far away. The people who work on the pineapple plantations are mostly very poor Costa Ricans or very poor Nicaraguans. And we don't want to see that. We don't want to think about that. I just want my pineapple cheap, juicy, delicious on my table, right? That's how most of us think. It's uncomfortable to eat your pineapple thinking about that girl that has no arms. You can do that every day, then probably you will stop eating pineapple. That's too much of a price, right? You block it out and keep eating pineapple. Super drastic. Guys, we have to stop, right? Sorry. So we can keep on talking about that in your session after this. Thank you.